Speaker.
I call the honourable member Moana Maki. Tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. Thank you very much for that. And I too would like to put on record my congratulations to the Honourable John Carter for his valedictory speech tonight and his new post in the Cook Islands. I think it's testament to the relationships he's had with people all around this House that any one of us could have added another 3 or 4 stories to the stories that he told in his speech today. And I do wish him and Leonie all the best. Mr Speaker, I've sat through a lot of budgets in my life. I'm not ashamed to admit that since about 1993, I think I've seen every budget live, either up in the gallery or here in the House. I would take the afternoon off work or university and come down and watch it. And without a shadow of a doubt, this was one of the worst budgets I have ever seen in my life, and it was bad on a number of levels. And I just want to make a few comments about the speech from Chester Borrows, and I do not doubt at all his sincerity. I do not doubt that at all, and I do not doubt at all his desire, as we all have in this House, to see the terrible ramifications of child abuse, of violence against children, of violence against mothers and families dealt with in a way that actually delivers results. But it astonishes me to have him stand there and not realise that the changes that his government has made over the last 3 years, changes which were very much brought home in Budget 2011, have only made things harder for the very families, the very children he was talking about, the very people that he was very eloquently defending, very eloquently discussing in terms of what needs to be done, are the very people who are hurting the most. And the problems that he outlined have only gotten worse under this government's watch. And so while I do not doubt the sincerity in all of his comments, I really just am astonished that there's this complete disconnect from reality with National Party members, that they just cannot understand the damage that is being done in our most vulnerable families. I take one example: family violence cuts. If you really, really are serious about child abuse, about the impact on children of witnessing violence, why would you cut family violence funding and funding for the Women's Refuge? Women's Refuge funding was cut. I don't know whether it's a deliberate disconnect. I don't know whether they just don't get it, Mr Speaker, but I would love to see some kind of backing up to the very fine words that we heard from Chester Borrows, words I believe we all very, very passionately agree with, but words, I'm afraid, which are just empty when you look at the actions of this government over the last 3 years. What this government did confirm, however, is that there is no plan. There really is no plan. We said last year we didn't think there was a plan. We said 2 years ago we didn't think there was a plan. Well, this budget confirmed that there is no plan. And we only have to judge this government on the benchmarks that they gave themselves. What were they going to do? Firstly, they were going to close the gap with Australia. Well, where did that go? Stop talking about that now. We don't talk about closing the gap with Australia anymore. Number 2, we were going to be aggressively coming out of recession 18 months ago. Well, no one talks about us aggressively coming out of recession anymore. In fact, we had to have Treasury 4% growth, Mr Tremaine. Treasury this week, 2 weeks after the budget, have already had to say, well, as Labor was saying on the day of the budget, the Treasury figures were overly optimistic. They were fairly fluid and flexible, and in fact, we've now had to downgrade. 2 weeks! We only had the budget 2 weeks ago, and Treasury is already having to pull the figures back in and say what Labor was saying on budget day, which is that those figures were absolutely untrustworthy. Absolutely untrustworthy. Where are these 170,000 jobs going to come from? I mean, Jacinda Ardern pointed out that in last year's budget they were promising 170,000 jobs or a bit less. Well, they didn't appear in the last financial year. They're being promised again, but there is no plan. There is no plan. You actually have to do something if you want to create jobs, Mr Tremaine. You actually have to do something. Just wishing them up out of thin air isn't going to do anything. And then the National Party really love rewriting history, because it absolutely kills them that they inherited from the last Labor government an economy that had net zero debt, that the IMF and Bill English said put us in a very good position to weather the recession. So when National took over government and they inherited low unemployment, they inherited low government debt because Labor resisted National's continuous calls for tax cuts and we saved for the rainy day, what did they do? They squandered it. And the legacy of this budget, Mr Speaker, is a $17 billion deficit that has grown on this government's watch. 7 or 8 times what Treasury predicted it would be when they took over in 2008. What happens to personal responsibility? All of a sudden, that's everyone else's fault. That's everyone else's fault. It's not their fault that they haven't done anything for 2.5 years. Not a single thing. The Australian government had an enormous economic stimulus package, $5 billion of which was housing. They've added 20,000 state houses to their social housing stock. They've done up 80,000 more. They kept builders in business. They kept income tax flowing from those workers. They kept their GST flowing from those builds. What did we do? Nothing. Nothing. We bought some projects that Labor had already agreed to fund forward 6 months. So let's have a look at housing in this budget, Mr Speaker. Because if you really want to see an area where it just shows that there is no plan and that the emperor has no clothes, you need not look no further than housing in Budget 2011. Because Prime Minister Phil Heatley, Housing Minister Phil Heatley put out a press release saying there's a $45 million contingency fund for the community housing sector. Great news. But then when you actually look at the numbers, what you discover is that, in fact, the overall housing budget has been cut. Because out of that $45 million, Housing New Zealand have to carve back and suddenly find $21 million so that they can pay a higher dividend to the government. Government's increased the dividend from Housing New Zealand by $21 million, so that money has to be found elsewhere. We also find out that about $30 million worth of programs have been cut, including the Housing Innovation Fund, which the day before the budget, the Housing Minister was doing a question to himself, a patsy question in the House, saying what a great scheme it was, all the time knowing that the next day that scheme was gone in Budget 2011. The Rural Housing Program, another great Labor initiative which we thought the government supported, gone. The Healthy Housing Program for Housing New Zealand to insulate state houses. And we all remember the song and dance routines we used to get from Housing Minister Phil Heatley, who used to jump up and down about what a great minister he was and how terrible Labor was, conveniently ignoring the fact, of course, that he'd hocked off 13,000 state houses when they were last in government, carried out no modernisation, and Labor had spent 9 years repairing that damage. Let's just rewrite history on that front as well. Well, the fact is all those programs are gone. And Housing New Zealand are going to have to come up and find this $45 million that apparently they're going to give to the community housing sector. We don't actually know that. And then Minister Phil Heatley says, well, it won't go to some of the niche providers. They'll have to find money elsewhere. Well, I'd like to know who the niche providers are, because I visit a lot of housing organisations. And I'd like to know, is the Salvation Army a niche provider? Is the New Zealand Housing Foundation a niche provider? Is Court a niche provider? Is the Nelson Housing Trust a niche provider? Is Habitat for Humanity a niche provider? Is the Queenstown Lakes Housing Trust a niche provider? Is Monte Cecilia a niche provider? Because these people aren't getting the money if they are. And the amazing thing about housing in Budget 2011 was there was no detail. In fact, it's only a contingency fund, so the money hasn't actually been appropriated yet, and it's going to be up to $45 million. But the big question is, what's going to be cut at Housing New Zealand to pay for that $45 million? Because there's no new money. In fact, the money's gone backwards. And I can tell you right now, Mr Speaker, it's going to be state housing, and it's going to be state house tenants who bear the brunt, once again, of this government. David Carter talked about the politics of envy. Apparently, when people on low incomes see a cabinet minister giving himself hundreds of dollars worth of tax cuts every week and say that's not fair, Mr Carter calls that the politics of envy. And he nods. Well, they're not envious, Minister, they're angry. They're angry. And maybe if the leader of the National Party got out and visited a food bank once in a while, or went back and talked to State House tenants about just how great this government has been for housing, then maybe Mr Carter wouldn't make offensive statements like that. Because people aren't envious, Minister Carter. They're hurting. They're struggling to put food on the table. They're struggling to keep a roof over their heads. They're struggling to pay for the basics for their kids. And they're angry because they know that a government that prioritises tax cuts for the very wealthiest New Zealanders, paid for by the very poorest, is not fair. And Labor says that's not fair. And we think it's time that some of that balance was put right. And we think that it's time that the hard-working families in this country, the families that Chester Borrows talked about, who are struggling to raise children in difficult circumstances, get a little bit more than just nice words from this national government. Because we may have a Prime Minister who's very good at the photo ops and who's very good at smiling and waving. But when it comes down to it, when you go out and talk to the people who are really suffering, this budget does a lot of damage. As Phil Goff has said, this budget doesn't help, but it does hurt.